audit from the state's comptroller reveals questionable spending of taxpayer and tuition money by staff members at Connecticut state colleges and universities.
Your reporter Marcy Jones is at the state capitol this morning live to break down the details. What's the latest, Marcy?
Good morning. Well, if you've never heard of a P card before, they're really at the center of this investigation. Those are actually state-issued credit cards that go to the chancellors as well as university presidents and some select staff members. Now let's go over some of the more controversial charges on those cards that the comptroller found in his report. At the request of Governor Ned Lamont, the state comptroller has spent the last 2 months combing through financial records by Connecticut state colleges and universities. The audit shows taxpayer and student tuition dollars was used for hotels, chauffeurs, lavish meals, and dry cleaning bills. Post-review comptroller Sean Scanlon has made 10 recommendations. He hopes they'll be adopted during the legislative session at the beginning of the new year. The #1 recommendation is to reinstate the internal audit function, a unit that CSCU previously eliminated.
Each one of the university presidents during the period we looked at, with the exception of the new president of Eastern, was using their P card for things that were a violation of state policy.
Now, the CSCU Chancellor Chang, he says that he has reviewed that report from the comptroller and that he is committed to implementing some stronger policies. In the meantime, some lawmakers are calling for his termination. Your reporter in Hartford, Marcy Jones, Channel 3 Eyewitness News.
Okay, Marcy, thank you. Well,